I'd like to welcome all of you to the Fiber Forum in Yellow Springs. And we're here to talk about fiber optic internet. And I'm going to start out by talking about the top 10 ways your internet connection is a little slow. So at number 10, when you click on the send button, a little door opens on the side of your monitor and a picture flies out. Number 9, you receive emails with stamps on them. Number 8, everybody you talk to on Skype sounds like Forrest Gump. Number 6, the ESPN website exhibits Heisman Trophy winner from 1989. Your credit card expires while you're ordering online. You post a message on your Facebook feed and it displays a week later. You believe a heavier string might improve your connection. Your graphics arrive via FedEx. And text on your web pages display as Morse code. So this brings up the point that the gigabit age of the internet is upon us. The internet is used on our devices everywhere. Desktop computers, smartphones, tablets and pads, automobiles, and even washing machines are now connected. We use social media to stay in touch with friends and family. We receive and pay bills with email. We use services like Netflix and Hulu to entertain us. We buy and sell items on eBay. We bank and invest, and we visit websites daily to find all kinds of information. There are an estimated 140,000 new websites created every day. Wikipedia reports that 12,000 new pages are created every day, and that it has 35 million articles in 288 languages. Every minute, Facebook users share nearly 2.5 million pieces of content. Twitter users tweet 300,000 times. Every minute, Instagram users post nearly 220,000 new photos. YouTube users upload 72 hours of video content. And Apple users every minute download nearly 50,000 apps. Email users send over 200 million messages in 1 minute. And Amazon generates over $80,000 in sales. So we are all participants in a great information explosion. The need for more bandwidth is growing exponentially. The internet is truly the most remarkable and the largest interconnected machine on the planet. But our connections to the internet are going obsolete. The current infrastructure in our village is mostly copper coaxial cable and twisted pair copper wires. Plain old telephone system technology, which dates back to 1876, and it's incapable of handling this growing need for digital information. We need to do something about it. There is only one technology capable of handling this exploding demand for digital information, and that is fiber optics. Fiber optic lines are strands of optically pure glass, as thin as a human hair, that carry digital information over very long distances. Optical fibers are ideally suited for carrying digital information. It's especially useful in our computer networks. We need fiber optic technology and fiber to the home in our village of Yellow Springs. Consumers who subscribe to fiber to the home consistently rate it as the fastest and most reliable broadband technology. They also appreciate that fiber networks can deliver many unique broadband services for business, medicine, education, home-based business, home automation, and entertainment. There's growing evidence that fiber connectivity encourages businesses to stay, helps businesses grow and become more productive, and attracts new businesses, promotes home-based startups, and helps workers telecommute. It makes a community a more attractive place to live, especially for young people, which can stem the population loss that many small communities experience. If inadequate healthcare resources hamper economic growth, fiber connections permit local healthcare providers to call upon specialists in regional health centers. And if an unprepared workforce is a hindrance to business expansion, fiber connectivity can enable cost-effective distance learning. Fiber to the home is only one component of an overall economic development strategy. but it's vitally important. Over the past few years, businesses have made a massive shift to cloud computing. For economic efficiency, their critical systems now operate at huge remote data centers rather than on-site computers. The speed, reliability, and security of fiber connections make cloud services possible. Local governments are attracted to fiber to the home because it positions their communities for tomorrow's jobs and economic growth. In 2010, when the internet search giant Google announced that it planned to build one or more community fiber networks, more than 1,100 local governments proposed their communities as suitable locations. This year, Yellow Springs has become a member of Next Century Cities, a nationwide organization that supports community leaders across the country as they seek to ensure that all have access to fast, affordable, and reliable internet. Our village thus adopted the following Next Century City principles. High-speed internet is necessary infrastructure. The internet is nonpartisan. Communities must enjoy self-determination. High-speed internet is a community-wide endeavor, and meaningful competition drives our progress. Our collaboration benefits all. Innovative approaches to broadband deployment present diverse challenges and opportunities to communities and regions. Working together, Yellow Springs can learn from the experiences of others, lower cost, and make the best use of next-generation networks. I believe these principles work well for our village. Next Century Cities now has a membership of 85 cities, including Columbus, Ohio, and it's still growing. All of these cities are building out or exploring options for municipal internet. A little later this morning, we'll be hearing more from Deb Sosha, who's the Executive Director of Next Century Cities. So it is my opinion that Yellow Springs will be best served if our village is the owner and progenitor of a public fiber optic infrastructure that delivers fiber to the home and business in an affordable and universal way. The benefits to our village will be truly rewarding. So we have an interesting and dynamic group of speakers this morning, and I would like to thank all of them who have donated their Saturday mornings to come here and help us in our effort. Our first speaker is Greg Dunn. Greg has represented telecommunication clients for more than 33 years, provided legal and strategic assistance to a variety of private and public clients. Greg has a comprehensive knowledge of both public utility and broadband issues. His clients include municipalities, the Ohio State Supercomputer Center, data centers, and wireless providers. He also consults on the Ohio public policy issues with Ice Miller Whiteboard, LLC. I give you Greg.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Is this set up properly? Okay, thank you. Thanks to Thor Sage for inviting me. I've been doing this for more years than I care to tell you, but the one thing I've learned is that 15 years ago, talking about broadband, people looked at you funny. Nowadays, everybody understands you have to have it. It is important for your health care. It's important for education. It's important for your quality of life. It's now become a significantly important thing in the communities. I mean, a number of people will speak later that I've worked with over the years. When you're talking about economic development and fiber optics, 15 years ago, people looked at you like you had three eyes. So I won't have to go into the the talk about what fiber does. That was already done, and I think you folks are already there. I'm not hitting the right button. So, we know that economic development and quality of life depend on broadband. We're already there on that. So what I'm going to do today is talk about, just get down to the practicalities. What doesn't work, what does work, and how you can make it work. And I'm going to be really, I think, straightforward. I've been doing this a long time. I was actually with Warner Cable back in the 80s. I've been on the dark side. I've worked with municipalities. I've been around on this issue. We're going to be straightforward, because I think cities need to get into this with their eyes completely open about what the benefits are, but also what the pitfalls are. Now, the first thing you think about is, why not the private sector? I mean, Adam Smith's invisible hand, free market is built to the United States. Why isn't that working, or why won't it work? There's a reason. It has to do with ROI. You have incumbent monopolies who were developed for telephone, which they had in fact, they had a de jure monopoly. They had a legal monopoly on service. And then you had the cable companies, which had a de facto monopoly. And because that's who they are, former monopoly people, they view making more investment entirely from a rate of return point of view. And honestly, that's who they are, and to expect them to be somebody different isn't going to work. And they have an obligation to their shareholders to get the best return they can. So they look at building new lines as what return can I get? And an Ameritech executive, Ameritech's predecessor to AT&T, at one time told me, he said, you know, we can make more money in the Huntington Bank building in Columbus than we can in Morgan County, Ohio. And so from a rate of return perspective, they're not going to invest in Morgan County, Ohio. They're going to go where they can get the best return. The best return may not be your community. The other thing they do is when they look at, say there's a new factory or a facility on the outskirts of town, and it needs fiber optics. Here's how they view this. They have to build a line out of their existing network to the new building. They will make that new building pay for the expansion of their network. They will, by having an upfront charge and a large annual fee in a long-term contract, they'll make that company pay. Now that works for them, it works for the incumbent monopoly, but it doesn't work for your community, especially if you're trying to attract somebody at that location. And they'll say, you know, what do you get? Water, sewer, road. What about broadband? You say, well, you'll have to negotiate with somebody, and you might get it at some time for some unknown price. So it gets in your way as a community, and so for you to expect help from the incumbent monopoly group, it isn't going to happen. Now there is a secondary group, which are data centers and competitive local exchange carriers, competitive phone companies and internet providers. They're a little more flexible. They may end up working with you, which I'll kind of get to later. But you know, Adam Smith's invisible hand is just not going to work in smaller, less dense communities. It hasn't, and that's why there's so many communities in America that don't really have robust networks available to them. You're hitting the wrong one again. So, how about the federal government? You know, the Tennessee Valley Authority, that worked pretty well. They're not the right solution either. They've got a lot of money, but one thing I've learned working with different communities and pretty much all over the country, mostly in Ohio, but everybody's different. Everybody's got a different set of facts. You got different geography, different assets in place, different amount of money, different assets in place. You know, Yellow Springs has an electric system with poles, bucket trucks, that sort of thing. You've got, you know, that's an example of assets in place. But the federal government idea of just spreading money around, especially taking it into Washington and then spreading it around, it's not a particularly good thing. When I say they can't get out of their way, when the Economic Recovery Act that President Obama put together had a big broadband component, and about a little over $100 million went into Ohio to 3 different entities to build fiber. Great idea. It became difficult because the federal government can't get out of its own way. They required environmental reports on pole attachments. I'm not making this up. When these folks wanted to put their fiber on poles, they had to file an environmental impact statement on the fiber going on the poles, because that was the rules in the grant. That cost them a lot of money. It was totally wasted, because nobody does environmental impact statements in the private sector when they attach the pole. So the federal government is like a clumsy mechanism. You might be able to get grant money or such, but kind of looking at this for a solution is not the place. Now, what about pure local government? By that I mean you do it all soup to nuts. A local government handles everything. There's issues that become involved. First off, there's risk. You get in this business, you are at risk. It's a business, and you could not do well. And I'll get into some examples of communities that haven't done well. It's a really fast-moving, changing environment. By that I mean, you don't even see the next thing coming. I mean, we had websites, and we got Facebook, and we got Twitter. The demands, the video streaming thing is now chewing up enormous amounts of bandwidth. That was, I think, unforeseen. Just two side stories. Ornet's the Ohio Academic Resources Network. It is a very large network. Ohio should be very proud to have such a network. It's a big network. It serves 120 schools. It's the backbone for the state network. 42, when I say state network, state agencies and such, 42% of the bandwidth used in Ornet is Netflix. I mean, and the other thing was they built, Governor Kasich built a 100 gigabit pipe on the Ornet facility, which is huge. I mean, it's just massive. And when Apple did that last iOS upgrade, they almost brought the thing down. They got to 92% of capacity. So anyhow, it's hard to foresee what's coming. It's a rapidly changing environment, which is sometimes difficult for local government. You've got competition is there too, because you have these incumbent monopolies, which have, at this point I was going to show a picture of the Lannisters. For those of you who do Game of Thrones, they have a lot of money. They have the ability to take on small communities if they like, and drive their own prices down. Now that's going to help your communities. Prices are going to be low, but it's going to increase that risk factor if they elect to do it, because well, Lebanon's a classic example, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but they ran pricing low in Lebanon, using basically Cincinnati to subsidize their unfair pricing in Lebanon, and they really hurt Lebanon in that process. I think this is one that people miss, and you may not have a situation here like that, but when you're running a big network like this, pay becomes an issue. You may have to hire people with sophisticated backgrounds in networking and IT and video services who would get more pay than the mayor. And that, sometimes politically that gets to be a problem. Also, this seems to be going away, but local networks, there's always a group that comes in and complains about pornography, whether it's pornography or not, but they want some kind of censorship on the video system. And of course, politics. I mean, you end up with groups that'll make it difficult for you to move quickly because they're opposed to this investment or that investment, because you'll have to make continuing investments because of the changing situation. So pure local government has its own inherent problems. So, kind of getting to what does work. The years of my experience is that public and private partnerships work best in this situation. And I'm going to go through some here and talk about them. Local government. Okay, local governments are very good in infrastructure. They build your roads, they build your sewers, they handle your water usually. In your case, they handle electricity. They're good at it. I mean, they develop systems to do it. They build it. They've got everything in place. You need the roads fixed. You need a new road. And fiber optics is at the ground level is just infrastructure. In most cities that I've known can build fiber optic networks fairly easily. It's just not that difficult to do. Cities are very capable of doing it. In fact, cities have opportunities that others don't have. And I think that's a key point. Fiber optics are often, when they're put underground, put in 1.25 inch plastic conduit. It doesn't cost much if you're building a road or building a sewer system or expanding a water system to lay another 1.25 inch pipe while you're doing it. Just put it in. It's very much just a small incremental cost in your big project of extending the sewer line or building a new road. Once you've got that 1.25 inch pipe, putting fiber in, it's not hard. I mean, they just blow the fiber in and push it down. And fiber itself isn't that expensive. So the problem the private sector has is they're always retrofitting. They're always building their stuff after everything else is built. So they got to dig through the ground, they got to cut the streets. They've got to spend a lot of money retrofitting. So if cities are involved, and then we'll go through some examples where cities have sort of taken advantage of their infrastructure situation and the fact that they are good at infrastructure. Cities understand economic development. When you want to develop, and I'm making this up, the west side of town, you've got a good location out there you want to develop, you know that's going to need fiber optics. Now the incumbent monopoly doesn't know that, in fact doesn't care, and they're not going to build to it in advance, or they're not going to have plans to build to it that you can show a new company. So you're going to be able to incorporate your infrastructure with your economic development. And of course, cities can make investments. You've got taxing authority, you've got bonding authority, you've got ways to get the revenues necessary to make the capital investment. Now, the private sector, what are they? Well, they're good at managing these networks. I mean, there are experienced people that are available that manage networks for a living. They know exactly what to do. They know the best way to do things. They're on the cutting edge. And that's their function. Data center people, CLECs, those kind of folks this is their business, and they're good at managing change. And if you've been in this business for a while, they're used to the fact that every 3 to 6 years they have to completely reinvest in their gear. They're keeping up on it. They're going to manage that change, and they're going to be good at it. Municipalities have a tendency to be reactive, at least in my experience. They're a little slow to the uptake. Sometimes they've got a political process, purchasing process. They're not going to be very nimble about these things. And of course, the private sector will invest if you can show them a rate of return. And kind of what I'm getting to here is if you have the infrastructure or build the infrastructure and they can manage it for you, that is one solution that kind of works. So well, New Albany is going wrong. That's New Albany, Ohio. These two cities, and I'll talk about how they did it. Gehenna was the model I talked about where they go in with the roads and the sewers. So they don't have a particularly well-designed network because it was put in piece part as they put roads and sewers in. But they've got a fiber network that they've contracted with a data center to operate the fiber network. And then the data center shares the revenues of the operation of the network. It's just a business network, but it's a revenue share model, and I'll talk about the legalities of how you might do that, but with a data center that knows how to do it. So the only investment the cities actually made is in the fiber that they built pretty cheaply because they were expanding roads and sewer and water. New Albany was a little different. New Albany, American Electric Power was going to put a headquarters in New Albany. And I was consulting with them, and I knew from experience that when a big electric company goes somewhere, they build their own fiber network to support their electric. So you knew they were going to build a big fiber build in New Albany. So on behalf of New Albany, we negotiated a deal where New Albany paid for about 1/4 of that fiber network, and AEP paid for 3/4 of it. And then New Albany got 96 fibers in that network, which they designed to serve the business district. And then they took that network and got in a deal with the data center on a revenue share where the data center operated and when I say data center, these data centers are very sophisticated now. And I'm not going to talk a lot about data centers, but that's where they house all the gear. They can light fiber, they can do data recovery services, they can provide connectivity to the internet, they can do all these things at the data center. So you give a data center access to fiber optics, now you've extended that data center out into your community, and those services become available to your businesses. So, like I say, New Albany is in a revenue share situation with the data center, and that's how they operate their fiber network. I'm not going to talk about Dublin, Ohio, because later on, Dave McDaniel, the city manager from Dublin, is going to speak. Dublin started doing this though in about 95, 96. They're way ahead of the game. And it would be very interesting to talk about the sophisticated way Dana and Dublin have done this over, God, that's a lot of years, isn't it? And that was fiber optics when people didn't think much about fiber optics. Now, Westerville's an interesting model because one thing, Westerville's got an electric system. Westerville spent some money on building fiber, but they used their pole lines, and again, they've got bucket trucks. That was not an expensive proposition for them to get fiber out. What they did that was completely different was they built a data center in Westerville that they then contracted with a private company to operate. So they've got a data center, a fiber network in Westerville, and the private company runs it and revenue shares back with Westerville. It's a pretty interesting model because they've kind of done both, and the company that's running it, it's working out pretty well for them. But that's the WeConnect deal. All right, a couple other models I just want to talk about. Chattanooga, Tennessee is probably the most successful, or at least the largest operation in the United States. They have their own electric. It's a Tennessee Valley Authority, created company. They're in about 5 counties now, and they have got hundreds of thousands of customers. They provide the whole suite of services. Be interesting. It might not be a bad idea for if Yellow Springs is moving forward, or thinking of moving forward, to take a look at what Chattanooga's doing. I'll get into opposition later, but in Chattanooga, the Tennessee legislature passed a law that limited the geographic reach of the Chattanooga system to keep it away from the private companies who had obviously lobbied really hard to have this happen. And then, talk about this, how we're in a good sweet spot with our governor and with our president right now, because the FCC then made a ruling that the Tennessee legislature couldn't do that. So they preempted the Tennessee legislature. And that was just in that part of that same day of that internet ruling. So anyhow, the Chattanooga is a very successful operation, and it is pure local. They've gotten over the hurdles and succeeded. I bring up one community. They're up in the Cleveland area. I don't think they've been that successful as an operation, but they have gotten north of $100 million in grant money over the last 7 or 8 years. They're a grant machine. It's a 501c3 that operates sort of like a local municipal government. Their route has been grants, and that is one thing you could look at, is setting up a not-for-profit and having it operated, and because these not-for-profits apparently are favored by the federal government for grant money. I have not been involved in a lot of it. Now, operationally, I'm not so sure that they've done as well as you might do with $100 million, but they have built a large network up in northern Ohio. All right, now we're getting to the bad side of things. Lebanon had their own electric, and they went ahead and built a fiber optic network, competed vigorously against Time Warner, and I'm trying to think of the phone company down there, but in any event, Time Warner went after them hammer and tong. They dropped their rates down to very low. They put a lot of political money into developing an opposition to, at the city council level, to the build. They filed multiple lawsuits. They continued to file lawsuits. They eventually wore Lebanon down, and Lebanon finally, after losing money at it for years, sold the system to Cincinnati Bell. So Lebanon ended up with the benefit of 2 operational fiber networks in town competitively, but they went through a real tough time. So they're a cautionary tale out there. Butler County was just corrupt. They went ahead and built a fiber network. I was approached, 10, 12 years ago by people putting that network together. It might even been longer than that. And it's one of those things where a guy comes up to me and explains what they're doing, and I don't understand it. And I'm old enough now to know if I don't understand it, it actually doesn't make sense. When I was younger, I thought it was me, but I declined to get involved, and a number of people were actually indicted. It was a shell game. They didn't dot their I's and cross their T's. It was not a good thing. Now, they got fiber optics built in Butler County, but I highly recommend you not do it that way. All right, so how to make it work a little bit. You need to build the political will, and obviously that's sort of what's being done here right now. The council members everybody needs to understand the risks and the possibilities and potential, and it needs to start with the community. And you're already there, so I really don't have to do much here. The dot I's and cross T's, that seems obvious, but it's funny, when you're talking fiber, people are like, this is new, fantastic stuff, so we don't have to do the things that our charter says for a city. We don't have to do the things that state law requires on purchasing. Somehow people get the idea, because this is this new fancy technology, that they don't have to do the basics. You have to do the basics. You have to follow the purchasing laws. But sole source, you can't sole source everything unless you've got a reason. You've got an RFP when you have to RFP. I'm not saying you have to be, kind of stupid about it, but you have to, you don't have to make it more difficult on yourself than you need to, but you just need to make sure you do it right, and do it legally right. And you don't want to discriminate either. That's the big one. You can get in a situation where you want this to be as neutral as you can. And I'll talk a little bit about net neutrality later, but I'm sure almost every community I've ever known believes in neutrality. But if you do RFP things, let everybody know. That's a great political protection. I don't know how many times in Dublin we've had the AT&T people come into our office to complain, and we'll say, well, we put out an RFP or an RFI, and you didn't respond. You could have had this deal that we gave to whoever, but you just didn't pay attention, or you didn't want to do it, and then they go away. So, you want to include everybody, and you want to, like I say, dot the I's, cross the T's. The financial is important. You want to have solid assumptions. You want to have this really looked at. A lot of consultants will come in and just have these spectacular assumptions that you're going to get 80% of the customers. You're going to take out X dollars per home. Doesn't take into account potential competition. Doesn't take into account startup difficulties. Day one, you don't get all the customers. It ramps up. You need to have, a good look at it from a financial point of view. So now I'll get to sort of the bigger political picture. You're in a sweet spot right now, though. Governor Kasich has been very good on the broadband issues. He's been the best governor the state has had. Fornet has been expanded, like I said, the 100 gig project. They're switching over to the state offices, to the backbone that the state operates. Despite significant political pressure from AT&T, who used to make gobs of money on the state of Ohio. Kasich has moved to a better model. It's much more efficient. If the state carries its own traffic, you can imagine how much traffic the state carries. When I said, data traffic, and the more they carry themselves, the less they pay the carriers, which AT&T finds angry. They also did a VoIP deal with Cincinnati Bell, not AT&T, Voice over Internet Protocol. So he has been promoting broadband. There's grant money that's available in the broadband area. It's been a very good situation. Now, interestingly enough, being a conservative Republican, the President of the United States is fairly liberal. And, he's had also good policies on the broadband issue. I like to tell people, broadband's not particularly partisan. Broadband is smart. And I think the smarter politicians from both sides of the aisle see the advantages, and also see, in Kasek's case, they understand AT&T's business model and why it doesn't work, because they're business people. And, you know, I think the federal government thinks that, you know, the government can do a lot more to help people. So, you know, between two of them, it's a good situation right now. I mean, this may go away. You know, we've been in situations in Ohio where the governor, I'm not going to name which governor, main advisors on telecom was the Ohio Telephone Association. That's not going to be a good thing when the industry is your main advisor. Now, we've got the future coming, and I talked a little bit about streaming, which is going to continue to increase. And this will be something for you all to consider. You know, the video services model, you know, I say that when you think cable TV, is going away. And it's just a matter of when. The bundle that we all have to buy, with 150 channels, 140 of which we don't watch, is going to disappear, because there's Netflix, there's Hulu, there's all these new services coming online. And the odd thing about this is the linchpin to this whole thing is ESPN, oddly enough. As soon as ESPN goes streaming, and you can buy it for $15 a month off your computer, the whole thing's going to break. Because you still can get off airs, you know. I mean, we can put rabbit ears on it, and that works pretty well, really. So you get rabbit ears, you get a good internet connection, you buy whatever video services you want, whether it's Netflix, HBO, ESPN, and that's how it's going to look. And I just don't know, I can't tell you it's going to be 2 years from now or going to be 8 years from now, but it is going to happen. And what that's going to do to the business model of the video providers is, I mean, that's their main revenue piece right now. And to make a prediction, there's going to be a big fight in the United States, because when they start losing money on the video side, they're going to raise your internet fees. And you'll end up paying $100 a month for internet if you have an incumbent monopoly. So that you may have to factor that into what you do. You probably, if you would do something, you may not make much money on the video end, but you certainly will shelter your community from getting hosed on the internet fees. That's just a prediction, but I think that's coming. So I tried to be as realistic as I could be about the potentials, the pitfalls, the ways to do it. I don't have certainly any special sauce, but I've seen a lot of this over the years, and that's my take on it. So if anybody, do we have time for questions, Thor?
Yeah, just a couple.
Okay. Ellis.
Yeah, does the state of Ohio have any particular limits aimed at making it difficult for local communities to do?
No, that's a great question, but no. The state of Ohio is fortunate in this regard. I was just in Indiana 2 days ago talking to some folks about this sort of thing. And the incumbent monopolies, there's a thing called ILIGHT, which is their ordinance. And ILIGHT is not allowed, can you imagine this? They've got a network for the universities. It's not allowed to provide service to hospitals or to K through 12. I mean, try that one out. They got that law put in, so a lot of states have these laws, but Ohio is completely clean. You just have your own charter and your own rules to guide you.
You talk about fiber optics and trucks and lines and whatnot. When you're talking about putting it in a community, does that mean running fiber optics to every house and building in the community?
No, that's almost another bigger discussion, residential versus business. So no, I mean, I'm talking broadly. Many of these examples, like the New Albany, the Gahanna, and coming up with Dublin, have been business district and economic development fiber optic networks. It does give you a leg up on expanding that into residential once you build a backbone network, say, for business. Now, Chattanooga, in that example, Chattanooga has gone residential, and they serve all the homes. Westerville, which has an electric, has not expanded it to homes, just does the business district. So that'll be a debate. You come in phases if you're going to do this. Maybe do the business district first, expand off of that. Maybe you probably have. I mean, now I'm getting into the weeds here, but you probably have a SCADA system for your electric that may be expandable with fiber optics. That's your monitoring system. that might be a good backbone to allow you to go residential. That's where you got to get into the weeds and figure out, the numbers.
You speak about broadband and changing every 2 to 5 years. What are we talking about in terms of rates, of transmission rates?
Well, it'll get cheaper per megabyte.
No, I'm not talking about the cost, I'm talking about the rate of transmission bits.
Oh, golly, it's,
What is it today, that's what I'm asking.
well, I don't have the number handy. I mean, Thorn might, I don't know. Moore's Law is fully operational here, which is, every year and a half, the cost of the same amount of computing power gets cut in half. And it's so the bandwidth usage is, I was gonna start with a couple of those charts, and I did, but, the bandwidth is just exploding, and it's gonna continue to explode. Thor maybe can give you the numbers later.
You kind of skipped over a slide where you talked about know your enemy.
Yeah.
You also mentioned the experience in Lebanon.
Yeah.
What pitfalls are we looking at here, a small community
Well,
against a big cable company?
Look, and I should have looped back that a little better. The cable company and the phone company, no matter what you do, whether it's a smaller one in business, whether it's a data center, whether it's, no matter what size thing you do, they're going to oppose it. Everything that you do that enhances competition, that brings more bandwidth, is something that their model doesn't like, because their model likes them being the only providers, allowing them to get money out of each line expansion they do. So the two incumbents will always oppose you. Other companies that are in the business may very well be your ally, but the two local monopolies, or former monopolies, will always oppose you. They're your main enemy. Got it cut off?
Yeah,
All right.
hey, at the end of the program, we're going to have an opportunity to take additional questions and work on some additional responses, and some of your other questions may be answered by other speakers. So in the interest of trying to stay as close to the agenda as possible, we're going to move on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Our next speaker is a remote speaker. It's Chris Mitchell from the Institute for Self-Reliance. He's going to speak on the rise of municipal networks. Chris is the director of the Community Broadband Networks Initiative with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minneapolis. He's a leading national expert on community networks and internet access. He runs MuniNetworks.org, the comprehensive online clearinghouse of information about community broadband. The Interactive Community Broadband Network map tracks over 450 such networks. He's also the policy director at Next Century Cities, and I believe he's ready to go online. Morning, Chris.
Is everyone able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Just all of a sudden the presentation switched to the other screen, so I'm thinking that you can still see it now. I should be able to see it too, and let's see if this works. All right, so I may not be looking at this correctly. Let's see. So I wanted to start off by just noting that local governments have gotten involved in this for a variety of different reasons, and the main one has been economic development. Really, the first three have been economic development, I'd say. And we're starting to see that change. We've seen local governments get involved to bring fiber to business parks, to bring fiber to everyone, to bring fiber to schools, and that sort of thing, as well as wireless. But I'm mostly focused on fiber for the purposes of this discussion. And we're seeing, more issues around digital equality, digital divide type issues. But it's important to recognize that the reason that most communities have gotten into this is really focused on creating a better environment for business. And the reason for that is that across our various infrastructures, we typically don't see prices vary significantly, right? If you go from one community to another, if you cross state boundaries, you might see the price of gas jump 50 cents, but it's not going to jump by a factor of 10 or 100. Same with electricity, gas, and water. But with broadband between two different communities, we can see a difference in prices of about 10, 100, or even in some cases $1,000 for comparable services. I meant 1,000 times, but often that is thousands of dollars. So local governments have had a mission of really wanting to try to make internet access, high quality internet access, to be more like these other utilities. It's not to say that it's the exact same as any of them. They each have different qualities, they're regulated in different ways. But the fundamental point is that we want broadband networks such that if we go out to a tech store, we buy something, we have it, we take it home, we know it's going to plug in and work. We know that we're not going to have to turn off our toaster to use a light bulb and that sort of thing. And that's why all this talk of gigabit networks, for instance, because we care about making sure we're able to do the things we want to do without having to become technical experts and figure out how to manipulate all our different things. So that's basically the short lesson, I think, as to why local governments have been getting involved. Now, my organization does a variety of things. We're a 41-year-old nonprofit. Most of our work comes out of Minneapolis, and we focus on a variety of issues, but about 10 years ago, we recognized that the internet was becoming essential, and that local governments had no ability to compel private providers to provide the kind of service that I was just describing, especially not on reasonable terms. So we looked at what local governments could do under existing law and found that basically they had to either own the network or basically try to come up with some sort of approach that would be led by the community, cooperative or nonprofit type approach. I think some public-private partnerships that are structured in certain ways certainly fit that model. But what we found is that ultimately whoever owns the network has the right to make the decisions about how it's used, and those have impacts on quality of life, on economic development, on all kinds of matters. So for us, we focused on two things really. Cooperatives, which is a solution that we think is most appropriate in your more rural areas, areas that have a lot of cooperatives already, and municipal networks, which is what I'm most known for because municipal networks have been sort of in the spotlight. They've been attacked most fiercely by private companies like Comcast and AT&T and those guys, because they recognize that local governments represent the most significant challenge that they face in the sense that local governments exist everywhere. And Google is going to challenge these companies in a number of cities, but local governments represent a threat everywhere. So that's where we've seen most of that effort. Mr. Dunn spoke a little bit about the FCC's decision. I'm not going to go over it. I'm trying to keep this presentation brief. But I want to note that the chairman has done a wonderful job of having a pro-competition policy. Just defeating the merger of Comcast and Time Warner Cable, I think, is a tremendous step forward for pro-competition policy. He's been working to try and make sure local governments have freedom to make their own decisions. In Ohio, you're largely unconstricted, so that's not really an issue that you have to worry about directly, although one never knows what a state legislature might do in an upcoming session. So it's something to keep an eye on. But Chairman Wheeler is possibly the best chairman that we can expect for a long time. President Obama's previous chairman was quite poor on a lot of these things, and frankly, no matter who wins the next election, there's no guarantee we'll have a good chairman, regardless of which party you favor. So one of the things that I like to ask people in this environment is, what's your plan? Because the FCC is a bit of a wild card. We don't think the federal government's going to take a major stand in this anytime soon. States are really going to be focused on more rural areas, which means areas that do not currently have cable service. So local governments that want to make sure they have good access, they have to come up with their own plan. And I often like to start off by saying, your plan has to decide what you want before you decide on the type of model. Rather than saying, well, we're really committed to a public-private partnership, now what can we do with that? I think the question is, what do you want to do? If you want to connect a number of business parks or a few areas to encourage economic development, well then a municipal model or public-private partnerships are possibly equally likely to give you a good result. If you want to get fiber out to every resident, the track record on public-private partnerships is not there. Municipal networks have done it, private companies have done it, but it's very rare to have seen a public-private partnership accomplish that. I think there's some new models that are being developed right now that are changing that, but that is the riskiest approach right now if you're trying to get fiber throughout your entire community. It's a little bit counterintuitive, I think, because theoretically I agree with Mr. Dunn that local governments don't have a lot of expertise in this and they tend not to be very fast moving. But the empirical evidence shows that local governments are really kicking the butt of incumbents across the country. And we're not talking about local governments against scrappy local companies. We're talking about local governments that are competing against some of the worst run companies in the country, the most hated companies, the ones that have a terrible track record of business. So I'm very aware of the shortcomings of local governments, as well as their positive attributes, frankly. But we have to keep in mind what we're comparing them against, rather than, I think, going back to the economic textbooks, which I think are generally correct. In this case, I just think we need a little bit of, to think a little bit clearly about it. Agree totally regarding the discussions about dig once, the conduit policies that Mr. Dunn brought up, so I'm not going to go over them again here. I think communities that are not thinking about how to expand access as part of other capital projects are doing their communities a disservice. So I strongly recommend thinking along that line and doing it quickly, because it should not require a lot of work. We've seen hundreds of local governments take a variety of actions, and we have this map available along with the key on our website. But in short, there's a lot of dark fiber approaches where cities basically treat fiber as real estate. We see approaches where local governments just make fiber available in a few areas of town, and then areas where fiber is available everywhere. We have about 20 states, roughly, that restrict local government access, but Ohio's not red, so you don't have to worry about that right now. Let's hope you don't have to worry about that in the future. And one of the things that we've seen local governments do is to band together. And in this case, the Coalition for Local Internet Choice is a national organization of local governments working with businesses and trade groups and others, including massive companies like Google and Netflix and others, that all believe local governments should be the one to make these decisions. And that's not just a decision to build a municipal network, but a decision to partner with another entity as well. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this, the Coalition for Local Internet Choice, I think, is one of the most hopeful approaches that we have for making sure local governments still retain this freedom to be making these decisions for themselves. So some of the things that local governments have done, the most common is connecting anchor institutions. Your schools, your libraries, police, fire, even hospitals in some cases. And we did a case study on Martin County in Florida. They were forecasting, I think, saving $30 million over 20 years based on the rates that Comcast was trying to charge them for an institutional network. I believe they're about 5 years in now to that, 7 years in, and they're estimating that their estimates of $30 million of savings were really conservative. They expect to see considerably more savings from all the benefits they're getting from owning their own fiber. And that's just really kind of focused on connecting local institutions, not even the businesses and that sort of thing. Other local governments, often having started with connecting local institutions, have gone further. And we did this case study on Chattanooga, Lafayette, and Bristol, Virginia, which were 3 pioneering fiber to the home networks, each for various ways. I agree, Chattanooga is absolutely one of the most successful. It's also not particularly instructive for a small community without a municipal electric. I think it's helpful to have a sense of what they did because everyone wants to talk about them. But you would do well as well to look at Sebewaing, Michigan, which is a village of 1,000 people. They also have a municipal electric, which gave them some advantages. But the very fact that they're a very small community that has done a gigabit is going to give you more lessons than studying what large communities have done. And then we have communities like Longmont, where they've decided to do only a gigabit. They're a larger community, 80,000, again, a municipal electric facility. But unlike, I don't know if you guys can hear, my beagles are baying in the backyard a little bit. Hope it's not coming through. Longmont has taken a different approach, whereas many of the municipal electric companies have basically become cable providers, where they use fiber optics and they offer very fast internet services. But they've copied the cable model of doing telephone often and almost always television. And that's because historically they had to do that to make sure that they could cash flow the system. That logic is changing a little bit. The idea being that you can now capture enough people with a fiber-only gigabit type offering that it may not be necessary to get into cable television, which frankly would be all but impossible for a community of your size without working with neighbors. So lessons from Longmont thus far are pretty good. It seems like up to half of the population is interested in a straight gigabit. But it's important to recognize one of the things about video services is they make it sticky. So if Longmont signs up 50% of the population in the first year, but in the third year sees half of them go back to cable or something like that, that's going to be a worrisome sign. We want to make sure that in deploying these networks, you'll be able to not only sign people up, but keep them as customers, because having a lot of churn is a real challenge to any business model. So the signs are good, but we're still learning from these approaches of only doing internet access. Then we have some communities that are doing an open access type approach. Again, this is really tends to be focused on for business generation in business parks and that sort of thing. It's more challenging to roll out this open access approach to residents. This is where the city generally creates the fiber network, but allows multiple ISPs to compete on it. Now, for a city the size of Yellow Springs or a village or a town, you're probably only going to have one or two service providers. So I think theoretically open access could offer some benefits, but in the short term, based on the current models of open access, they may not be very significant. This might be something that you keep in mind for a future if we see a different flavor of open access that I don't want to get lost in. But right now, open access is kind of the idea that you can choose your one service provider for internet access. In the future, open access could mean I'm taking, one service from this company, another service from that company, and a third service from this company, all over the same wire. If we see a real rise of telemedicine that wants to have the direct fiber connection rather than being intermediated by an ISP. And I'm afraid I might be confusing you a little bit, but let me just say that open access is something that's in flux, and I think has a tremendous amount of hope. But for a small community, you're not going to see a lot of providers wanting to jump on immediately. And then I wanted to end with a note that some local governments have gotten into real trouble. This is a risky investment. Most of the local governments have succeeded, and a number of local governments have actually succeeded so well that they have more money coming in than they're spending. And so, like, if you look at Thomasville, Georgia, they've lowered their taxes on local businesses because of the success of the network. In Spanish Fork, in Santa Monica, you see these networks, the fiber networks, actually subsidizing other cities' services. And so that's those are outliers. Like Chattanooga, the average community network basically pays its bills and is net even. It generates indirect benefits for the communities. But the general result is that it just generates enough cash to pay for itself and doesn't put anything extra into the general fund. And then we have a few communities that have basically not been able to pay their bills. Communities like Utopia, which you may hear a lot about, and this is a mixture of communities, about 12 in Utah, where they were real trailblazers, but they made a lot of mistakes, and they faced some real nasty opposition that handicapped their ability to raise capital and then hurt their ability to finish their build out. So they have some real problems they're dealing with, a lot of debt. And it's important to become aware of what mistakes they made, because you don't want to repeat them. And you want to be able to explain to people who might say, well, we don't want to be another Utopia. You want to be able to say, well, we know what Utopia did wrong, and we're not gonna make those mistakes again. And in fact, we've seen very few communities make those mistakes again, because local governments tend to do a really good job of figuring out how to lower risk. If for no other reason, then local elected officials often lose their jobs if they engage in something like this without being well prepared. So the last thing I wanted to say was that when it comes down to this fiber, it's important to note it's not only about the fiber. In Chattanooga, they basically use the same technology that Verizon uses, but they've seen tremendous benefits far beyond what any community that has Verizon has received. And that's because they operate it in a different way. Incentives matter. local governments, nonprofits that are rooted in the community, local businesses that are rooted in the community, they have a different incentive than a big fiber network, like even Google. So you have a similar technology across FiOS to Google to local governments using, but you see different outcomes from each because they have different incentives. So I think it's important to recognize those different incentives as you're considering what solutions you might be looking at, and recognize that fiber from a private company may not be the same thing as fiber from a local government or something that's rooted in the community. I hope we can have a time for a question or two.
Yes?
I'm curious about what the operational difference is, an example of the operational difference is.
I think I'm gonna need someone to repeat it. It's a little garbled.
She said she is interested in knowing what the operational difference is between
The local fiber and the private fiber.
between the local fiber and the private fiber.
So, for instance, when you have a business that may be coming to town to locate, and this may not be applicable to you, but I think you'll get the lesson and the analogy. If you have Verizon doesn't really care whether a new business settles in your town or not. They're going to basically just view it as a customer. Whereas the local government will say, well, let's get the Chamber of Commerce involved, let's do everything we can to roll out, we'll make sure that it's very affordable. So you have communities that don't have their own fiber. For instance, there's a community near the Denver Metro that the local business was quoted $25,000 from Comcast to connect fiber to their business. That's outrageous, and it's basically a cost that Comcast charges because it knows it can get away with. A local government might look at that and say, well, that's 2 days of labor, you know, we'll maybe get you into, we know that you're going to be here for a number of years, so we can amortize it over that, and we'll charge you a couple $100 or maybe $1,000 as a connect fee. And so you have different incentives in terms of how you're looking at that. Chattanooga launched their service in 2009, I want to say, 2010, somewhere around there, with it was 15 megabits per second symmetrical. They've since not changed the price, and every year they boosted it except for last year. They went from 15 to 30 to 50 to 100 over the course of 4 years, meaning the slowest connection you could get on their network was 100 megabits a second, all for the same price. So, you know, Verizon has boosted its speeds over times over its FiOS network, but they've raised their prices, you know, not every time that they boosted their speeds, but rather significantly. There's actually no reason to raise prices for delivering internet access to the home because the cost of delivering internet access is falling faster than demand is increasing. So when you see prices go up from Comcast to Verizon, it's not because of a technological imperative or economics, except for the fact that they basically have a monopoly. So those are the kinds of differences we see. You know, local government says, well, we don't need to try and rip everything out of the community that we can in terms of the highest prices we can charge. They say, we're going to have all these benefits. We're going to have more people wanting to live here if we keep our prices low. So that's some of the different mindset and how it works in practice.
Please go ahead.
How do you counter the argument that the monopoly that now serves Yellow Springs will cut their prices in half, or do everything they can to prevent the village from having its own fight or community?
Okay, Chris, he said, how do you counter the argument that the incumbent service provider will cut their prices dramatically in order to interrupt the progress of the local municipality?
It's a sharp question, and the answer is that you need to expect that. And so if you do a survey that basically says, you know, if we're going to be the cheapest price in town, would you be interested in taking service from us? You need to understand the operative question there is lowest price in town. The local government is almost certainly not going to be at the lowest price in town. Incumbent providers always have an advantage over market entrants, because out of new market entrants, because the incumbent has amortized the cost of the network already. So they have lower bills to pay. They will also pay less for content, less for physical gear. They pay less to advertise per person because they're doing it over a wider footprint. It's important to recognize local governments really are fighting uphill every step of the way. Now what you do have is good local service. You have the fact that you're going to keep money in the community. And from what I've read about your community, I think that would be an argument that resonates. Although I admit I've not been there and I'm not an expert on it. And so I think the goal is to basically prepare to be undercut on price, to let people know that's coming, to let them know that that's a benefit of what you're doing, and to make sure they understand that if enough people don't take service from the new network, it will go away and you'll return to the old high monopoly prices. So it's really a matter of educating people. And I'll just throw in something that I think Mayor Joey Durrell of Lafayette teaches very well every time he speaks, and that's that if you have a local provider, particularly a big incumbent like Comcast or a Time Warner Cable or someone that's opposing you, that's a great gift because you can get more headlines in the newspapers and you can use that to educate people. If you face less opposition that's visible, it'll be harder to educate people. So I would say you should hope for some opposition because controversy is what causes people to get interested in things. And that's where you have to be ready to educate people with these sorts of things so they're not fooled by the lower prices that are temporarily embraced by the incumbent providers.
Okay, one more.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. I was wondering if you could clarify, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but you'll repeat it. The symmetrical issue, he raised the issue of symmetrical, and I just thought if he could clarify what that means so we're all on the same page, because there's a huge difference between the tiny upload speed versus the download, which is predominantly what these monopolies will give you is a big fat download with a tiny upload, which leaves assets and media trapped in your home.
He's asking if you would mind clarifying what you mean by symmetrical, as far as download and upload speeds, and how local municipal fiber network might even provide a higher quality of service than another.
Sure. There's sort of this false understanding of how we use our networks, which is the idea that, I stream Netflix, and I also operate a home business on the side. I do sports photography for local universities and colleges. And over the course of a month, I download a lot more than I upload. And so that's used as an argument, often by the larger companies, to say that my downstream connection should be much larger than my upstream connection. And historically, there's technological reasons as well for shaping the connection in that way. Municipalities have been leaders of, and Google as well, have been leaders in the idea that you should be able to upload at the same speed that you download. And it makes sense, I think, in the sense that as a small business, when I upload, the fact that I don't upload as often as I download doesn't change the fact that when I upload, I want it to happen quickly. When I'm uploading multiple gigs of files to clients at night, I want it to complete before I go to bed to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And so just because I happen to upload less than I download doesn't really tell an ISP anything about how fast I want those things to happen in the moment that I'm doing them. So when you look at cable connections, for instance, cables architecturally, for a variety of historical, technological reasons, cannot do fast uploads. And so you have the ability for cable to go very fast on the download, although most of us really don't experience that yet, but it's coming, and slower on the upload. What that means is there can be bottlenecks. If you have a lot of people in your household that are simultaneously doing video chats, playing video games, doing other sorts of things, you may have a very fast download connection, but you may have a bottleneck on the upload. And local governments have typically wanted to have fast upload connections because they want to encourage people to be effective from home. You want to be as effective from home doing your job if you're telecommuting than you are in the office. And I would argue that's not possible on a cable connection. It's not possible on half of the Verizon tiers, but on municipal fiber networks, particularly the ones built in the last 5 years, and all of Google networks and all the sort of local incumbent, I was trying to think of the word spry, the really fast-moving, interesting companies like Ting and Sonic, those companies are all doing symmetrical, and it's tremendous for local businesses, and I think that's something that local governments need to recognize.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dana McDaniel. He became the City of Dublin, Ohio's 5th city manager in January. He's been employed by the city for nearly 27 years, and he's served in various roles, including management assistant to the city manager, director of service, deputy city manager, director of economic development, and director of development. He served with the City of Dublin during a time of rapid growth and expansion. As the city's first director of service, he led the establishment of a service department that was one of only 9 in North America to be accredited by the American Public Works Association. He was instrumental in the development of Dublink, Dublin's state-of-the-art broadband fiber optic network. Dana?
Well, good morning, thank you. I know you're all thinking he could not have been in that city that long unless he started when he was 5 years old, which is true. To be clear. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And I have to say, Greg and I are great partners. We've been working on that system, this system, Dublink, I'm going to tell you about, for 20 years. We started our dialogue in 1995 in anticipation for the Telecommunications Act and deregulation in 1996, right? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Chris and Greg did an excellent job of giving you a good overview, I think, of these municipal networks and the ups and downs and the peaks and the valleys and the challenges. I'm going to give you an insight as to what we're doing. It's just going to be a case study for you to perhaps sort of look at. We don't have all the answers. It's working well for us, and I will tell you kind of how we got started, where we've been, what we're doing with it, how we've leveraged it, and where we're going in the future. So I'll cover this hopefully fairly quick. An intern of mine came up with this catchy phrase, Dublink. I thought it was kind of cool. Tim Fesselmeyer went on to be an attorney somewhere in the world. I don't know where he's at, but I have to give this guy credit for coming up with Dublink, kind of catchy, we think. But anyway, okay, so what the heck is it? Well, it is a fiber optic network, but as Greg said, and as I just mentioned a minute ago, this was born out of crisis, which many communities, a lot of the reasons a lot of communities get into this is sometimes it's born out of crisis. A lot of communities will create broadband infrastructure or new infrastructure or redevelopment because they have an economic crisis or something like that. Our crisis was born out of fierce competition, rapid growth. In the early 90s to mid-90s, as a very robust growing city, we were one of the fastest growing cities in the state, actually in the country at the time. We had just put $70 million in new infrastructure, namely in roadways. Then this deregulation thing was coming along, and we had these high-density new office buildings, fairly new office buildings that were coming out of the ground left and right. So we envisioned the incumbent companies and the not just incumbent, but also the competitive companies digging up our brand new right-of-ways, which were new roads, new boulevards, highly landscaped, digging this stuff up over and over again. We said we didn't want that to happen. So we commissioned a company called the Official Company to build a conduit system through a franchise backed by a right-of-way ordinance, which Greg authored for us, is now used throughout Central Ohio and other cities, to put in this multi-conduit bank system throughout our geographic area. So let me just kind of orient you to how all that lays out. So this is Central Ohio. This is downtown Columbus. You'll see the I-270 outer belt here in sort of the light gray. This is City of Dublin up here in the northwest quadrant. We're about a 24 square mile city. We have a population of about 45,000 people. Our daytime population is close to 70,000. We import more jobs than we export. This dark orange area is our commercial corridor along the I-270 and the US 33 corridors. So that's where our fiber optics is concentrated. So when I told you about that deployment of multi-conduit bank system called Dublink, that's where it all started, was in that corridor. You can see all those green squiggly lines, which essentially tells you we have that conduit at the curb to almost all of our businesses. We have nearly 3,000, actually we have not nearly, we have well over 3,000 businesses in Dublin. And that conduit runs to the curb in front of almost all of them. The official company on the back end of the 90s, after they built this, when the telecom industry was going gangbusters, remember the telecom bust of 2000? They went ahead and they loved the double link model so much, they went ahead and built another 100 miles of it throughout central Ohio. So went up into the Polaris area, came out here to the Whitehall area, picked up Easton Town Center. They picked up all the growth nodes, picked up a lot of the data centers, points of presence they call them, central offices along the route, came back in to generally into the Ohio State University area, essentially following High Street, came down into downtown Columbus, kicked back out Broad Street, and around through Hilliard back into Dublin and tied back into our system. Our system's about 20 miles, actually it's about 25 miles now, and then this other system's about 100 miles. So after the telecom industry tanked, there were a lot of warehouses laying full of fiber optics, spools of fiber optics. They couldn't even give it away practically. So official company came to us and said, hey, look, there's a lot of cheap fiber laying out there. Would you guys like to deploy fiber optics throughout the system? So Greg and I had been experimenting with interconnecting our city facilities. We had done some conduit and fiber optic trade with Time Warner, cable, the local cable company at the time. And oh, by the way, Dublin at the time was serviced with 2 cable companies. We have 6 cable companies in our community right now. We have our residents have a choice of about 3 different cable companies and have for many years. Just keep that in the back of your mind. So at the time, they said, look, do you want to deploy the system? We had been toying with interconnecting our own facilities. So this, you got to think this is kind of experimental stuff back in the early 2000s. We had interconnected a couple of our own city facilities. So our IT people understood the value of interconnecting our own facilities. So it was a wider, not a local net, but a wider network interconnecting buildings, because we were building city facilities, trying to keep up with the growth. We had staff in houses. It was just, I just got them out of houses about a year ago, but we've been connecting all those facilities. And I'll show you the cost savings that we had by doing that. But what we figured out is, hey, there's something to this interconnecting of these buildings thing. We're not quite sure what that means. So then we had a situation that came along where Battelle, who had a presence in Dublin, out here, generally right about there. And then Battelle had the mothership, if you're familiar with Battelle, the largest not-for-profit research institute in the world. And their headquarters was down here by OSU. So we eventually figured out and learned how to interconnect those 2 buildings. So then we started to get on to, there's something to this, not sure what it means, blah, blah, blah. So at the end of the day then, when official company came to us and said, yeah, you can deploy for really dimes on the dollar fiber optic system through this conduit, we'll let you do that, or we'll sell you that throughout the whole 125 miles, a 48 pair 96 fiber for $3.2 million. So we took that to our city council, and I have to tell you, they took a leap of faith. So we talk about risky, so they took a little risk, and they allowed us to do that. I'll talk to you about that return on investment here in a minute. I will tell you, it was a plane we built as we flew it over the years. We really didn't know what all this was going to amount to. We knew that there were challenges, we knew there was some risk, but we just knew there was something to this. It was futuristic, it was out on the edge, so we were going to drive it. So that's what we did. Okay, so what were some of the things that we started to do then? One of the earliest projects we did after we went ahead and made that investment is we created a partnership with the Ohio Academic Resource Network, which Greg mentioned a few minutes ago. And Greg will probably chuckle when he hears this story. But Greg and I he was telling me one time a story about Procter & Gamble, and this was what really got us thinking about it, who had a research development center in Mason, Ohio, but they had their mothership company in Cincinnati. They were running, as a research and development company, they needed to run cycle time on supercomputers. They would do logarithms, right, on scrubbing bubbles. Procter & Gamble, that's how you invent this, that's how they do this. It's very scientific. So they would export their data analysis to the East Coast. So we got to thinking, you know, the Ohio supercomputer, which at that time was the fastest, biggest, greatest supercomputer in the United States at the time, as I recall. I think it's still there, right next to it. What if we connected our businesses to that? What if we connected businesses to the supercomputer? And we were trying to attract research and development companies, which was a niche that we wanted to have. And we could do what Mason, Ohio, and they're good friends of mine, couldn't do at the time. So that's what led us to the connection to Battelle, the interconnecting, the power of that. We formed a partnership. This was in 2005, when we finally got this, it's been 10 years ago, finally made this connection. So we interconnected our fiber optic system, which was through the entire 125 miles, to the supercomputer down here at OSU. Now, we didn't do a lot with it until more recently, and I'll tell you that story here in a second. But we developed what we called CORN, the Central Ohio Research Network. Because our vision was that we could interconnect businesses, schools, universities to this system. Just recently, Ohio University established, oops, what did I just do? Did something.
Sorry.
Sorry, Thor, thanks. I hit the top button, I shouldn't have. I'm not a technology guy, by the way. So Ohio University is in the process of building a new campus here. This is the College of Osteopathic Medicine. One of our incentives to them was to interconnect them to Ornet. By interconnecting Ornet, they're connected to Athens. So we're able to get the university interconnected. So anyway, so that's an example of Central Ohio Research Network, our partnership with Ornet, and some of the things we've been able to do with it. So I'll just leap ahead. So just in the last couple of years, we were able to interconnect a couple companies of ours that do modeling, analytics, prototyping, and simulation. So people can actually sit in their cubicle now and run cycle time on the supercomputer. A guy by the name of Ray Lito with Lito Engineering, who does analytics, prototyping, and simulation for NASCAR, Indy, aeronautics industry, and the trucking industry, sits in his cubicle, and his people sit in their cubicles and run the cycle time and their simulations off the supercomputer. Since the center of gravity has shifted for Honda from the West Coast to Central Ohio, I don't know if you know that or not, they just built a $300 million R&D center and a new headquarters way out that 33 corridor, by the way, way up that way, north of Bell Fountain. We have tier 2, tier 3 R&D people coming to Dublin, chasing that shift in that center of gravity and connecting to our fiber optics, because they want to be able to access and do R&D on the system. So we are actually in the process of now talking about how do we build a fiber optic network out 33 to Honda. So we have a coalition that we built with Union County, Marysville, and ourselves to work on. And so this thing of economic development, promoting economic development, has big impact leveraging fiber optics. I'll give you more of that story. Another thing we did is we built a 24 square mile Wi-Fi system. And we did that also in a public-private partnership with a company called High Speed Air. Not the greatest success story in the world, I will tell you that. But we did learn a lot from it. We were able to leverage it, I feel, get our money's worth. It was a public-private partnership where the city paid for the deployment of the capital. The city retained 25% of the bandwidth capacity for its public use, and then the company could roll out a private use subscription service on the backside with the other 75% of the bandwidth availability. They did deploy it over 24 square miles. It's had its ups and downs. We're out now on the backside of the curve of the technology. So, you know, the technology when it was put in, good stuff. It's been 10 years ago. High quality, cutting edge technology. It's been 10 years, kind of on the backside now. So now we're shrinking that footprint down to creating just hotspots within the city where we think people will use it most. And that's going to be in our parks and where we do the Irish Festival and places like that. So good news story is we bought that equipment at dimes on the dollar. We bought that 10 years ago after all the municipalities were out there talking about, oh, we're going to do, you know, Wi-Fi. And all these municipalities were doing this, and they all tanked. And a lot of them tanked because they weren't the right fiscal model when they did them. So guess what? There were warehouses of access points, which we bought on for dimes on the dollar, just like we did fiber, so then we can deploy that very cheaply too. So we really do three things with our fiber optics. One, we use it for institutional purposes, which I just talked about. I'll give you a little bit more information on that. We also leverage it for economic development. I gave you a couple early stories about that. I'll give you a couple more another story here. And then we also sublease dark fiber and make a revenue off of it. And I'll give you those numbers and what that means for us. So these are companies that currently are connected to our fiber optic system. Wendy's corporate headquarters is in Dublin. Nationwide has leveraged it some, although in a very limited way. Nestle has a quality assurance center in Dublin, very high-tech laboratory. They access it. I mentioned Battelle. OCLC is the Online Computer Library Center. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They digitized the Dewey Decimal System, supports 70,000 libraries in over 170 countries internationally. They leverage it. They have a big data center, and they use our fiber to go to a backup data center. I want to tell you the Ohio Health story really quick. It's one of my favorite stories. And this is one of the first projects we did as well for economic development purposes. Just didn't understand the power of it until this. So we'd already bought the system, we'd already deployed it. So I'm going to go back to this base map. Ohio Health came to Dublin and said, look, we're thinking about bringing 300 new jobs here. It's our back office operations where we do billing and stuff like that. We've already identified the building we'd like to go into. I said, okay, great. So of course the next thing out of their mouths is, what incentives can you provide us? So we get into the incentive battle, right? We are competing with other cities for this project. Okay, got it. So we lay out our sort of core common incentive package that we would normally do in this kind of case. Called me back and they said, Dana, you're just not quite getting there. We think one of your other peer cities has probably a better deal for us. Of course they always do, right? So can you come down and talk to us one more time? Because sure, I'll come down and talk to you one more time. So what I did is, I thought, what else can I do? I'm not sure what other incentive I can leverage. We had started to learn about the fiber optic connectivity piece. So I took this map, essentially, and I started plotting all of their facilities on it. So they have 2 hospitals and a headquarters down here. They have other hospitals out here on the ring, surgical centers. They were planning on a new hospital out here in Dublin, which they have built since then, Dublin Methodist Hospital. And then the building that they wanted is right there. And so obviously it was on our fiber route. So I went to the meeting, the middle boardroom, got the CE, got the COO, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Legal Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Information Officer. So I took a map like this, took copies of it. I had plotted out all their facilities. And I just I said, well, gentlemen, I don't have anything else to offer you but this. We own this fiber optic system, don't know what you're going to do with it. Maybe you could interconnect all of your buildings and might save you a little money. I said, we've been experimenting with it. We don't know exactly what it means for us, but it's kind of a nice thing to have. Slid the maps across the table. Here's the chief financial officer. He's got the map upside down. He's not really sure. The chief operating officer's, looking at me like I had 3 eyeballs. Chief legal officer is already packing his stuff. The chief information officer, excuse the expression, but looked like he was about ready to wet himself. And so I said, thank you. I hope this, helps us out. Have a good day. That's all I got. Before I could get to my car, my cell phone rang, which was the big bazooka cell phone in those days. And they said, you got the deal. Because the chief information officer realized the cost avoidance of interconnecting all of those facilities. And now these days, the vice president of IT for Ohio Health is on video talking about our economic development impact that we had for Ohio Health. Since those 300 jobs, we have nearly 1,500 jobs in Dublin now because they've relocated all their IT operations and so forth to Dublin as well. So they've taken full advantage of that interconnectivity and connected all their facilities. I will just tell you they save millions of dollars a year. Now, the one logo that's not up here, that I hope soon will be, because sometimes these things take generations of people to get. I'm on my fourth superintendent of schools who gets it, and we will have them interconnected and build a system for them, I'm convinced. And then Cardinal Health, who is a Fortune 2022 headquarters in Dublin, founded and grown in Dublin. I think they're up to 3,500 employees. They're in 6 different facilities, has never used our system. We finally got an indefeasible right to use agreement to them. They're running through it. I think they're going to connect up all their facilities. And the last number I got from them through this is second hand, but I feel it's pretty accurate. They would save $5 million a year by connecting to our fiber optic system and lighting their own fiber among 6 buildings. Now, these are big numbers of employees, I got it, it's big volume. But the point is, the cost avoidance, you need to take a really good look at when you analyze your fiber optics for your own facilities. Because there's another piece of this that you can leverage into building out a system, and that's all the public use. So if you had your schools, your municipal use, county uses, if you have any state facilities down this way, colleges, universities, and so forth, can leverage this stuff with a highly intense public institutional use, and the cost avoidance alone for that is incredible. Okay, so I'll give you some examples of that. So with our model for economic development, these are with the companies we've had agreements with, not counting the ones that we don't have agreements with, but might come to Dublin because they want to access this. We've attracted and retained nearly 10,000 jobs. Now, because we leverage a 2% income tax, try to put this into some economic development perspective, obviously there's second, third, fourth order impacts to that economic impact. But the direct economic impact to the city for our investment, when we collect 2% income tax off of 10,000 jobs at about $45,000 per job, which is way on the low end, I will tell you, that's a very conservative estimate, has been and will be $31 million. That's just to the city. I think that number is really closer to 40 million because I took a really low average salary and based it on that. So it's really, as you can see, this will pay for our $3.2 million investment a few times over. And really the investment's more like about $5 million now with other things that we've done to it over the years. So it's still a significant return on investment. We've saved $4 million the last 10 years as a city because our cost avoidance is about $400,000 a year. Have about 400 employees in several different facilities. And as I mentioned, we have this wide area network that we connect and run ourselves, light our own equipment, run our own operation, connect back to data centers, and bulk purchase, like you bulk purchase salt for your streets, you could bulk purchase internet service cheap. Has saved us $4 million over the last 10 years. We will earn $2.2 million for the life of these, we call them IRUs, which are just a contract to use our fiber optic. We will earn $2.2 million over the life of those by leasing our extra capacity. So we lease to carriers who want to use it. So it's been a good revenue source for us. So what are we going to do in the future? You know, Lou Zaccarella, one of the co-founders of the Intelligent Community Forum, and I know the Century City is going to be talking to you today. Great organization. We're probably going to join them as well. I'm behind getting there. I was going to do this last fall. I would also encourage you to get involved with the Intelligent Community Forum, the ICF. We've been very involved with them as well. Lou Zaccarella, one of the co-founders of the ICF, has been to Dublin several times. And Lou said to us in a crowd one day, kind of like this, the people who are really involved in our activity, and he said, you know, you guys, he said, having the infrastructure is the easy part. Having the infrastructure is the easy part. Because as Greg said, you know, municipalities, what we do best is we do infrastructure. And we do infrastructure to set the conditions for the quality of life of our residents, but also for economic development. And doing infrastructure with fiber optics, it's as easy as building streets, frankly. But it has this significant return on investment. What Lou said that I will never forget, he says, it's one thing to have it. The other thing is what do you do with it? What you do with it is what's important. So we are on this mission to do bigger and better and greater things, which is why we are connecting businesses to the supercomputer, which is why we're connecting it to our school system and our schools and building out for our school system. You know, which is why we are connecting small to medium-sized businesses to data centers who normally wouldn't have that opportunity to do that. Hence, the future of what we're going to do is 100 gigabit. So what we're going to do is light, this goes to the city council, right, Greg? A week from Monday. They've already budgeted for this for 2 years, and we've been working at it. But we will light our fiber optic backbone to 100 gigabit capability. Doesn't mean it'll just run at that, but will have the ability for people who want to connect to it to operate up to 100 gigabit. So all these Google cities doing 1 gig, who cares? We're going to do 100 gigabit. But if you think about, you know, why, it's because in these legacy office buildings that I have that are approaching the age of about 30 plus years now, I got to keep these buildings competitive. Because if I don't keep them competitive in lease rates and infrastructure and all this kind of stuff, and broadband is probably the key infrastructure I'm going to need to keep our community competitive and to attract and retain business. So we'll be doing a 100 gigabit project, and these are the kinds of things we can do with it. We can backhaul small to medium size, any company, but focus on small to medium sized companies who keep their servers in their closets or in their basement, kind of like our city did for a lot of years. I don't know what it is about IT people, they gotta hug their servers every day and they gotta see the lights blinking. But you know, that stuff can be down the street in a good quality data center, which we happen to have right in the middle of all that. And it can operate in that environment. And our companies don't have that access, and we're gonna give them that. They can connect to the supercomputer, like we talked about, in Internet 2, which also has 100 gigabit capability. And you can do that from Yellow Springs. You could create interconnectivity to Internet, probably already connected to them through the county or whatever. Apps as a service, we have 2 professors out of Ohio State, one out of University of Missouri, creating a system regarding pushing applications out to small companies. So we actually beta tested that within our entrepreneurial center where we have 100 startup companies. We beta tested in there and people loved it. So we think we'll be able to push that out to companies, you know, around Dublin. Internet, phone, and video. My point there is simply that if I can backhaul your company to a data center, or you, just like I do with the city, you know, my fiber optics goes into multiple data centers around Central Ohio. Because I'm in a data center, I can plug and play and pick and choose who my internet service provider is. So when I talked about buying salt in bulk, you can do that with ISP. So the reason I want to make that point is in a public-private partnership, if you can get back to a point of presence like that, you can then partner, perhaps, with the incumbent or someone to come in and compete with the incumbent without having to do it all yourself. So that public-private partnership thing is really critical. And in data analytics, we have a data analytics center with IBM right in our town, and the reason there's a question mark there is we're talking to them about what's the so what of that. So I bring up the Intelligent Community Forum, the Intelligent Community Year. We were a 4-time number 7 in the world, a 4-time number 21 in the world, a 2-time top 7 in the world recognition for our fiber optic system. That's gotten us global recognition, which has helped us in the economic development world. US Ignite is another group, in addition to like Century Cities and others, I recommend you take a look at. So Doublelink is about trying to be intelligent as a community, create economic vitality, which has been a big focus of ours, and to get our companies connected. Now what about our residential side? As we partner with and build out to our school systems, I will tell you we will take a hard look at whether or not or how we can better serve our residents. Because one of the very earliest reasons we got into this and thought about it is because Dublin was divided by phone providers at one time. And there was a disparity in service levels in our residential areas. And that's what caused us to really look at it in the early years, in addition to the Telecom Act change. And we just never really got there with the residential service. So I applaud you for looking at that. And as cities do, provide great infrastructure, you can do great things for your residents and for your businesses. And that concludes my presentation. I know we're running behind, so thank you.
questions for Dana?
Danny, you talked about sort of stumbling into this with buying 48 pairs of fiber from Fishel back 20 years ago or whatever it was, but is everything then, all the success and growth since then, still all built on that original 48 fibers? I mean, is there a capacity issue that you're facing?
It is. We've been running on that 48 pair all this time. We just finished a deployment of an additional 48 pair over top of that, only in one part of our city, and that's where we're going to launch the initial 100 gig project. And that's just simply an architectural thing, you know, handing off fiber to companies or multiplexing over the same fiber so you have multiple people in the same fibers. So we've been, as I mentioned, we divide our fibers into our 48 or 96 into thirds. A third of it for our institutional use, a third of it for economic development, and a third of it for leasing.
Okay.
So that we've been very tightly controlled. In fact, my city council put caps on that and said, do not go past that unless you come back to us for permission. And I did that with them because I wanted them to control me on how I did that. So it is a public asset, it has to be controlled.
Okay, thanks, Dana.
Thank you.
We're running a little behind, which is not unexpected. This is a very complicated subject. So I think the best thing to do would be to take a brief 5-minute break right now, and then we'll have Alex Figueroa speaking right after the break. So maybe get back in about 5 minutes if you can. Thanks.